Yeah, Al-Karba tells us in Hilchos Ribbis base, Asr lehis asik min leiva mal v'biribis. It's forbidden not only to lend money with ribbis or to borrow money with ribbis, as we discussed in the previous share, that one who lends money with ribbis is over on six lavim, six biblical prohibitions. And one who borrows money with ribbis is over on at least two or three. But besides for the lender and the borrower, anyone who's involved with the loan is over on a nisr of ribbis. Call me Shahaya by name anyone who was a broker between the lender and the borrower. Or assisted any one of them, or who directed them to a place where they could lend money or borrow money. Violates a biblical prohibition of lifnei iver l'sitat mikshel, not to place a stumbling block in front of a blind person, which means not to cause someone to sin. If this prohibition would not have been done if not for this person's involvement. If this transaction, if this loan would have happened even without this third party's involvement, so then there is no biblical prohibition of lifnei iver l'sitat mikshel, but there's still a rabbinic prohibition of of assisting somebody to do an avera, even if they could have done it without your help. But since you did help them, so that is asr midirabanan of an isser of misayah or of machzik avera, which are different ways of saying the same thing. Umisha nasa eid b'neihem. Until now, we're talking about somebody who assisted indirectly. Somebody was looking for somebody to borrow money from with interest, and another guy came along and said, "Oh, you can approach this and this person, and they'll happily lend you money with interest." So there's an isser of either lifnei iver or messiah in such a case. However, somebody who that has a hands-on participation in the actual loan, for example, is served as a witness to the loan, or as a guarantor, or a cipher, somebody who wrote the actual loan document. Over beloisa seshel Torah, such a person violates, besides for lifnei iver, a special biblical isser, a Torah prohibition of simun alav nashech. It's an isser deraisa simun alav nashech that applies to somebody who is involved in the loan in any capacity, besides for the lender and the borrower. Even if this loan would have happened with a different set of witnesses, or a different or without witnesses at all. I'm sorry, without witnesses at all, or without a cipher or whatever. There's still, once you get involved, there's an isra of like siman alav neshech. Even somebody who serves as a guarantor on only the principal. The Alter Rebbe tells us if somebody serves guarantees only the principal, they don't guarantee the interest, so they're not involved with the ribbis, they're involved only with the principal loan. They're still over on an isser of lifnei iver, because there's no like siman alav neshech over here because they have nothing to do with the interest, but there's still an isser of lifnei iver, again depending on the situation whether the loan would have happened without this guarantor's involvement or not. So first of all, how do we translate this to contemporary business practices? So obviously, if a witness and a guarantor and a cipher, the scribe who writes the loan document are over on an isser of l'siman alav neshech, so it goes without saying that a lawyer, a notary, a secretary who writes checks, an accountant, if the sometimes the accountant is just running the numbers, which maybe that's perhaps it's debatable whether that's similar of neshech or not. But if the accountant's actually writing checks and has a hands-on involvement, so obviously that's also involved in similar of neshech. And besides for the lifnei iver issues, um, the bottom line is that a person is not supposed to have any involvement whatsoever in any type of ribbis transaction. There's an important point about Lifnei Iver, which is relevant not only by ribbis, but in general, Lifnei Iver is a very common shaila, especially with shluchim, um, and it requires really careful analysis of each situation for itself because the halachas of Lifnei Iver are quite they could be challenging. There's no simon in Shulchan Aruch Hilchos Lifnei Iver. It's all spread out all over the place, and there are different rules and uh, and limitations, and obviously. A lot of times we have a specific interest in getting around Lifnei Iver because a lot of times certain things that again when it comes to shlichus and when you're trying to help someone, but there could be an issue of Lifnei Iver. This is not a share about Lifnei Iver, but since it came up and since it's relevant over here, just to mention one important point, and especially since this is mentioned by Pesachim specifically here, when it comes to ribbis, which is as follows. We mentioned earlier that there's a difference in Lifnei Iver and there's a difference between the biblical prohibition of Lifnei Iver and the rabbinic Midrabanan version of Lifnei Iver, which is called Messiah, and the distinction hinges on whether or not the Isser would have happened without the third party's involvement. Where does it come from? There's a Gemara in the Avodah Zarah that says if a Nazir was a person who made a vow that they're going to be a Nazir for Hashem, which involves certain restrictions. One of those restrictions is that a Nazir is not allowed to drink wine. So somebody who causes a Nazir to drink wine is transgresses an Isser of Lifnei Iver. So the Gemara tells us in Masechus Daf that if a Nazir is standing on one side of the river, there's a cup of wine on the other side of the river, and the Nazir is not able to reach the cup of wine on his own. So if you get up and pass them that cup of wine that they would not have been able to reach on their own, so obviously that there's a problem over there of lifnei iver leisitel mechshel. You facilitated the Nazir's ability to transgress an isur deraisa of another drinking wine. If the cup of wine is on the same side of the river as the Nazir could bend down or take a few steps and get it himself. However, you pass it to them, so then there's no Isser deraisa. There's no biblical lifnei v'leisitel mikshel. However, there is a rabbinic Isser of Messiah. What is the halacha if it's two sides of the river, but you're not the only person on the other side of the river? So in other words, the Nazir is not able to get it himself, but he is able to technically get it without you, because the other person could pass it to them. Says the Mishnah Lamelech, if you pass in such a situation, if you pass the Nazir a cup of wine, you're over on Lifnei Iver Deraisa. This is not called it could have happened without you. Because ultimately, the Nazir needs someone else's help in order to be able to transgress the Isser in this case. So if it wouldn't have been you, if it wouldn't have been him, it would have been you. If it wouldn't have been you, it would have been the other guy. That's all called Lifnei Iver. That's not called Messiah. Applying that to ribbis, if the loan needs a lawyer to write a contract, so there are other lawyers in the world, right? So then this is the question hinges on this. The halacha is dependent on this din. According to the Mishnah Melech, if you need a lawyer, the fact that they could have gone to a different lawyer does not absolve you of the isser of lifnei iver. However, there are those who disagree with the Mishnah Melech. According to them, doesn't matter. The fact is that there are other lawyers in the world, and being that it didn't have to be you, um, means that there is no the rice level of Lifnei Iver in this case. Now, the Alter Rebbe does not address this clearly. Um, Perhaps there's room to be medayik one way or the other in the Alter Rebbe. I don't really want to get into it because the truth is, if we're being honest, that you can't be medayik anything definitively. from something that the Alter Rebbe does not address directly in this case, and therefore we're just going to leave it at that. There is the opinion of the Mishnah Lamelech. In any case, the question is only if it's an Issa Deraisa or an Issa Derabanan, but it's everyone agrees that this is something that would be forbidden. Now that we've finished all our introductions, the previous year and what we spoke about just now, and we can actually talk about what ribbis is. So first of all, it's important to make a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that whenever we talk about Hilchis Ribbis, it's important to know that there's a difference between Ribbis Deraisa and Ribbis Derabanan, and there's a big difference in Halacha between Ribbis Deraisa and Ribbis Derabanan. Just like in all areas of Halacha, that there's a difference and an nafkamina between prohibitions that are Deraisa and prohibitions that are Derabanan. And specifically, when it comes to ribbis, there are three main distinctions. Because again, like, what is it? You know, we keep all both the halachas and prohibitions that are there, isim and both are there abundant. So why does it matter? It does matter. It matters for the following three reasons. First of all, the halacha is ribbis deraisa, which is also called ribbis ktsutsa. So we'll discuss soon why it's called ribbis ktsutsa. Ribbis ktsutsa yoitza b'dayanim. It's machlekes in Gemara, but this is the halacha that when you come to Bezdin and Bezdin sees that their loan took place here that involved ribbis, the eraisa biblical level ribbis, the malva, the lender who collected the ribbis is obligated to return the ribbis to the borrower. Even that doesn't matter how much it is, doesn't matter how much time passed. The halacha is ribbis ktsutsu yetze b'dayanin. If you don't want to pay it back, then Bezdin kaifin umakanese achetete nafshe is what says Shulchan Aruch. I'm not going to translate it, but that's Bezdin forces you to give it back. However, ribbis derabanan, there's no obligation to return ribbis derabanan. There is it's called latzisidei shamayim. To fulfill one's spiritual obligation, one should return ribbis derabanan, except for certain types of even lower level ribbis derabanan, called ribbis muktemes, ribbis mecheres, which again we'll discuss all these things in detail. That even latzisidei shamayim, there's no reason to return. There's no need, at least, to return ribbis mukdamis, ribbis mocheres. But generally, ribbis derabanan, which is also called avak ribbis has to be returned latzisidei shamayim, but Bezdin certainly cannot force you to give back ribbis derabanan. So that's the first and primary distinction between ribbis deraisa and ribbis derabanan. The second important difference between ribbis deraisa and ribbis derabanan is ribbis deraisa is forbidden under any and all circumstances except for pikuach nefesh, just like all other, uh, halachas that are suspended in the situation of pikuach nefesh, besides for three isurim that are never permitted, even in cases of pikuach nefesh, but ribbis is permitted in case of pikuach nefesh. However, ribbis derabanan is permitted. Many types of ribbis derabanan are permitted in a situation of tzarich mitzvah, when it's for a mitzvah, or it's tzedakah funds, or it's a shul, or for Yisayimim, or L'Kavod Shabbos. The Alter Rebbe tells us in Hilchos Shabbos. Actually, the Alter Rebbe does not speak about this in Hilchos Ribbis, but the Alter Rebbe speaks about it in Hilchos Shabbos. Um, Ribbis derabanan is permitted. Now, obviously, it's important to understand what Ribbis derabanan is and what a tzarich mitzvah is, but that's just and when another will speak about it in more detail. That's just a general, the general idea that ribbis derabanan is permitted with tzarich mitzvah, and the third difference is, it goes without saying, that when we have a suffix, so if we're dealing with ribbis deraisa, we're going to go lechumra, because suffix deraisa is lechumra. When we're dealing with the derabanan, we're going to go lakula if we have a suffix. Or to put it in other words, when we're dealing with a situation, as we mentioned, ribbis has a lot of concepts. Once you understand the concepts, once you understand the principles, so then you could look at each case and decide, is this ribbis or is this not ribbis? Is it ribbis deraisa or is it ribbis derabanan? Or is it permitted altogether? Now, the truth is that it's still not always clear because sometimes the situation is a gray area. So then, a lot of times, what we can determine is that it's at most ribbis derabanan. If it's at most ribbis derabanan, plus we have other factors that we can consider, so we can be makel. However, if what we're dealing with is potential ribbis deraisa, so then the burden of proof is much higher to prove that this is something that can be permitted, and even then, maybe it can be permitted, but it's better to do it in a way just in case with a heteriska, or to do it with doing some other method in order to get out of a potential ribbis deraisa uh, issue. Um, just one other example that's somewhat tangentially related, but it is related, which we mentioned, ribbis derabanan is mutter l'tzerich mitzvah. So the Alter Rebbe tells us in Hilchos Shabbos that somebody needs to borrow money. Alter Rebbe is in Siman Rish Mem Beis Siftas. Mutter lilvis beribbis shel devrayim l'tzerich su the Shabbos v'yamtiv elo tzerich shar su das mitzvah im efshar lilvis b'lei ribbis. If it's not possible to borrow money without ribbis, then it's permitted to lend money with ribbis shel devrayim, ribbis derabanan l'tzarich so the Shabbos v'yamtiv. Al tzarich simmereish man beis siftas. So you're allowed to borrow money with ribbis for l'tzarich so the Shabbos, l'tzarich so the mitzvah. That's very nice. What's the heter to lend money with ribbis? So the loiva has a tzarich suda. The loiva has a tzarich Shabbos, tzarich yamtiv, tzarich suda mitzvah. What tzarich mitzvah does the malva have? So the Alter Rebbe in the Kuchas Achrim deals with a few different ways of approaching this question, and one of them is because we're dealing with ribbis derabanan, so meaning midaraisa, there's no ribbis over here, everything is permitted. But because it's ribbis derabanan, efshir delay gazru klal dvar mitzvah afala malva. The Alter Rebbe says in the Kudrash Sachin, meaning that the whole thing is midarabanan, meaning it's a gzeir that the sages decree that this is considered ribbis and you shouldn't do this. However, since it's l'tzerich mitzvah, there is no prohibition on the loiva, but therefore even the malva there's no prohibition. Okay, if that went over your head, then that's fine. But that's just another way of conceptualizing the difference between ribbis deraisa and ribbis derabanan. That when it comes to ribbis derabanan, we already have a lot more uh, wiggle room. Of course, it's obviously very important to know what ribbis derabanan actually is, and it doesn't mean that we can just disregard ribbis derabanan. Again, within the halachic principles that are acceptable and mainstream and could be used as hopefully we'll discuss in more detail as it comes up. Okay. So what is ribbis derais? The following is the lashon of the Alter Rebbe. Klali shel ribbisu. The general rule of ribbis is kol shonaitel mechaver is eschar ba'ad hamtanas hachayev shehu chayev li. Anyone who takes from their fellow a payment for hamtanas hachayev, which is for waiting for the money, which in the Gemara is called agar noterle. Hamtanas hachayev is a translation of agar noterle. When one person lends money to another person, that money, as far as the lender is concerned, is not doing anything for them. It could be sitting in the bank and collecting interest from a guy, obviously. It could be invested in the stock market. It could be invested in some kind of business venture. But now I lent this money to someone else. So eventually I'm going to get back the money, but I'm going to get back exactly what I lent, not more, not less. So let's say I lent money for 6 months. So for the past 6 months, my money was the lashon of halacha batal. The money was batal. The money was not doing anything. We call somebody who doesn't do anything a batlin, right? So the money was batal. Maybe it was doing something for the borrower, but it definitely wasn't doing anything for the lender. So compensation for this period of bittul, for this period of the fact that the money wasn't doing anything for me, that is ribbis. The amount of time that I waited for my money back so that I could finally do something with it, I could finally invest it, and then for the past 6 months, I lost out on potential returns from this money. Compensation for that waiting period is ribbis. Now, it doesn't have to be 6 months, it could be 6 minutes. If you're on your way home and you borrow money and say, I'm going to pay you back as soon as I get home, that's also ribbis, derais. There's no difference. But that's what ribbis is. So hamtana sachayiv im hu neitel ba'ad hamtana sachayiv bilvad shelo yel yedei makach memkar. If okay, we'll go back to makach memkar at a different time. Harezu ribbis shel teir. So waiting for accepting payment for waiting to get your money back, for doing nothing more than paying for time is another way of saying it. Paying for time is ribbis if it was stipulated at the time of the loan. Or even if it wasn't stipulated at the time of the loan, it was stipulated at a later time. For example, if we made a loan for a period of 6 weeks, let's say, and then the six at the time that the borrower was supposed to pay back, he came and he said, "Listen, I don't have the money. Can you give me another 2 weeks, 3 weeks? It doesn't matter. Let's say 2 weeks to pay it back." And the lender says, "Sure, if you pay me back an extra 10%, that is ribbis de eraisa." It's also called ribbis ktsutsa. Ktsutsa means stipulated ribbis. So if at any point the ribbis was stipulated, whether it's at the time of the loan or at the time that the loan was extended, it was stipulated that the borrower is going to pay the lender back an additional money for the amount of time that it took that they had the money by them and that they did not return the money to the lender. That's called ribbis ktsutsa. It's called ribbis deraisa. Ribbis ktsutsa that the dayanim force you to pay it back, and that you don't get up at chesamesim and all the other things. That this is the real ribbis. It's worth mentioning that the second point, that the ribbis that was stipulated on at the time of the extension, not at the time of the loan, the ribbis that was stipulated on the time of the loan is ribbis deraisa according to everyone. Ribbis that was stipulated at the time the loan was extended is a machlekes rishonim, machlekes Rambam and Ravid, but the Shach writes in Simon Kof Samachlav that Haskamas HaPeskim is that even at the time that the loan was extended, if it was stipulated, if ribbis was stipulated at that point, that's called ribbis de Iraisa, and and the Alter Rebbe also brings it. The Alter Rebbe doesn't mention that it's a machlekes because obviously Reiv HaPeskim are machmer, and we're dealing with the Deraisa. So first of all, by the Deraisa, you have a machlekes. Your Deraisa halech char machmer. The Gemara tells us in Avodah Zarah Daf Zayin, and Chesed Mishpat Simon Chapei, and that's the rule. And Befrat Yachad V'Ravim Halacha K'Ravim. So you have Ravim, you have a Deraisa Machmer. So Machmer, there's nothing. The Alter Rebbe doesn't even feel any need to mention that there's a machlekes over here because it's irrelevant. Um, Another important thing. It doesn't even if the debt did not originate as a loan. And this is a very important point because it's very easy to make a mistake. We're going to see that ribbis that did not originate as a loan, that originated as a sale, or as a rental, as chirus, or as something else, that is in many cases ribbis derabbanan. However, that's only when we're still dealing with a transaction. But once the transaction became a debt, stipulating ribbis on that debt is ribbis deraisa, is ribbis ktsutsa. For example, if I bought something, but I didn't pay yet, so now it started off as a transaction, but now the transaction is over because I already received the goods. Now there's simply a debt that I owe to the seller. If I pay ribbis, and it's stipulated that I'm paying ribbis for extending the payment period, that is ribbis deraisa. Again, this is a discussion of Pesachim, but the Alter Rebbe says it clearly, Im teve chayv acher she'enei machmas halva v'nesim leharchiv hazman is ribbis k'tzusa deraisa. Okay, so why is it so important to understand what exactly is ribbis deraisa, and that it's hamtanas achayv, and that it's agar notar, and that you're paying for time, or you're paying for mois beteles, because it also helps us understand what ribbis is not. Now, a lot of times something is not ribbis deraisa, but it's still ribbis derabanan. But there are some things that are not ribbis deraisa and they're not ribbis at all. For example, very common case where somebody owes money to another person, but they don't remember how much. They don't remember how much. So borrowed money from you, might have been $150, might have been 160, might have been 107. I'm not sure. So I'll pay you back $175 just to be sure. Now, what if the reality is that I only borrowed $150? So now I'm paying you ribbis, right? But it's not. It's not ribbis because it's not agar notar. I'm not paying money I'm not paying extra money for the amount of time that I had the money. I'm paying money because I'm not sure. I'm paying money because I don't want to be stealing chas v'shalom. So paying money for a different reason that's not for agar nater, that's not for hamtana sachiv, is not ribis. Now, yeah, it's you have to be very careful with this with this rule because just call if it's actually ribis, then calling it something else doesn't make it not ribis. Calling it a present is not ribis. As we discussed in the previous share. Call ribis in matana mechila mayalas because all ribis is a matana. It has to be real. It has to be true. I'm really not sure how much I lent, and therefore I'm really paying a little bit extra just to be sure. I know for sure it wasn't more than $175. So therefore I'm paying that. But to give 180 just in case, because it took me an extra couple days to pay back because shlemazel and it didn't end up happening. So that's ribbis. That's real ribbis. Paying extra money because it took extra time is called paying for time. That's ribbis deraisa. Okay, if it was stipulated, obviously. If it wasn't stipulated, it's still Rebbe Starabanan, as we'll discuss. But if it wasn't stipulated and the payment is not for time, then there's no Rebbe at all. So this is the Avnei Nezer says this, and the Minchas Yitzchak says this. So it's Avnei Nezer and Cheshem Mishpah Chav Gimel, and Minchas Yitzchak speaks about it also. Chelik Tes and Peches, very important tshuva, which a few different, very important things over there that he says in Mechatzitza, which we'll discuss in different contexts. But one of the things he says over there brings from the Savnin. He said that if you're paying extra because you're not sure how much the loan originally was, this is not ribis because this is not agar noter. This is not schar hamtonas mois or hamtonas achayv. Another thing, is it permitted for the malva, for the lender, to charge the borrower a fee? There's a certain I lend $1,000, I'm getting back $1,000 because that's how much the money was. I'm not charging any interest. But there are certain administrative fees. I have to pay secretary to write the checks and the processing and whatever. Um, is that ribbis? In other words, I'm lending $1,000 and I'm getting back $1,000 plus a $30 fee. So it looks exactly like ribbis. It's stipulated from the outset. Nevertheless, it's not ribbis because the fee is not for hamtanas mois. The fee is for real expenses. Now, again, it has to be real. It has to be real expenses, and it can't be any more than the real expenses. Because if it's more than at the very least ribbis darbanan, it looks like ribbis, Mexican ribbis. Other there could be other issues, but if there are real fees, there are real expenses associated with the loan, administrative fees, and things like that. So that's perfectly okay. The Bris Yehuda writes about this in Parak Tes. In the Chalkas Binyamin, I didn't write it down, but if I remember correctly, he suggests okay, the fee shouldn't be a percentage of the loan because that's already scary. You're playing with ribbis, playing with ribbis deraisa. So don't do that. Even though if I remember correctly, he says even though that's technically also permitted because again, at the end of the day, it's a fee and it's a fee for a real expense, and that's fine. But don't make it a percentage of the loan. Make it a fixed dollar amount. Um, Again, when it comes if it's nagaya um, in a real life situation, so should consult a Rav who has expertise in the ribbis, but these are just general ideas. And once we understand that ribbis is agar notar, so we understand that something that when it's not agar notar, it's not ribbis. What is ribbis? Agar noter. Has to be a loan, has to be stipulated at the time of the loan or at the time that the loan was extended. And there has to be a payment that's given for hamtanas achev for the amount of time that the money was out of commission by the borrower. Is there ribbis deraisa by things that are not money? For example, uh, tons of examples. You borrow eggs from your neighbor, you borrow flour from your neighbor, you borrow sugar. Um, and can you pay back more? Or maybe we can't pay back more, maybe it's ribbis derabanan, but is it ribbis deraisa? So you don't have to look too far to find an answer to this question. To look through the Gemara and they say neshech, not to look through Shulchan Aruch. It's a pasuk in Torah. L'sashich le'achicha neshech pesef neshech oichel neshech kol davar asher yishach. Any ribbis whatsoever, even if it's not money, if it's something that's worth money, if it's flour and eggs and sugar or something else, it's ribbis deraisa. Again, if it's stipulated at the time of the loan, or at any other time if it's stipulated. Afilu eitzim vavanim, the Alter Rebbe says. Bein shahribis mimin, whether the ribis is the same type, the same thing that the original loan was, by borrowing a dozen eggs and paying back 2 dozen eggs, bein shahid avar or there's something else, borrowing a dozen eggs and paying back a dozen eggs and a bag of flour. It's also ribis de eraisa if it was stipulated. So, you borrow eggs from your neighbor, you have to give back not more than what was given. Now, we'll discuss in a later point that even to give back the same amount that was given is a separate issue, the Rabbanan issue of halva sabisa. But again, that's a the Rabbanan issue, and there are various heterim for that, and there are many ways to get around that, which we'll discuss. You have to be, it's important to be aware of it. It's important to make sure that those leniencies are actually applicable, but very often they are, especially when it comes to borrowing small things like this from neighbors. But besides for the issue of sabasa, which we're not getting into right now, so borrowing items from another person, even if it's not money, uh, if it's stipulated at the time of the loan that you're going to give back more than what was borrowed, that is ribbis deraisa, and even if it wasn't stipulated, it's ribbis derabanan, as we'll discuss in greater detail probably in the next year. If you borrow eggs from your neighbor and you come back and you return the eggs, the same amount of eggs, and also flowers and chocolate, for the for the loan, then that's an issue of ribbis, at least derabanan. However, the Pesachim say, before we get to what the Pesachim say, let's just give another example. According to this, to borrow half a bottle of milk from a neighbor or half a bottle of oil, you have to return half a bottle of oil, half a bottle of milk. Can't return a full bottle of milk. Can't return three-quarters of a bottle of milk because then that's returning more than what was given. If it was stipulated, that's service deraisa. If it wasn't stipulated, it's service deraban. However, today's Achronim write that it doesn't mean that you have to measure with a ruler to the millimeter that there is not a drop more milk or more oil than what you originally borrowed. Whatever is more or less, you borrowed half a bottle, you give back half a bottle, whatever looks like half a bottle to you is okay. I didn't really see a written explanation of this kula anywhere, even though it makes a lot of sense. Because first of all, if you don't say this in l'shafkas chay l'chalberia, but again, it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because it's ribis b'shas piroin and sadavar moed, and it's you're not stipulating that you're giving it in exchange for the loan, and you can say it's ragal b'kach because okay, when we speak about ribis mekdamas reis mecharis, we'll maybe get into this more, but this is the what today's Pesachim say, and it makes a lot of sense, and I haven't seen anyone who disagrees. So now let's think about another common case. You borrow a book from your friend or a neighbor, and you return the book, and you really appreciate that your neighbor, your friend lent you the book, so you buy them flowers. chocolate in exchange for the great favor that they give you in lending you a book. So, Bashkafa Rishena looks like ribbis, looks terrible. However, it's not ribbis. Why is it not ribbis? Because I wasn't alone. Alone is when you borrow something and then you use it and then you return something else. When you borrow cash, you don't return the same cash. You return different cash. You spend the money. It doesn't not necessarily cash. It could be digital money also, it could be whatever, but you spend it and then you return something else in exchange. But returning the same exact object is in English we call it al borrowing. But in Lashon Kodesh, in Halacha, this is called not halva, it's called shaila. And shaila, there's no ribbis by shaila. Therefore, um, Chuvas to talk about it. Mar Makomis, if anyone was Mishnah, Shalos Chuvas Mishnah Halachis, Chelik Vav Siman Kuf Beis, Shalos Chuvas Chaya Levi, Chelik Beis Siman On Gimel, and others. If you borrow a pen from someone and it breaks, you can return them brand new pen, even though you borrowed an old used pen that was on the verge of breaking and you return them a brand new pen. So it looks like mamish ribis. It's not ribis because it was never a loan to begin with. You borrowed something, you were going to return the pen itself. And then it broke, so now you have to compensate them for breaking it, which maybe you do, maybe you don't. We're the Mesa Machmas Halacha, which is it's a different style of Shemir. But let's say you want to do you want you're willing to return to compensate them for the pen that broke, whether or not you're obligated to. So you're allowed to return a brand new pen. You don't have to find one that's the exact same level of use, and you're allowed to even return a nicer pen because it's not ribis. There was never a loan here to begin with. If you borrow a car, you're allowed to wash the car. Uh, there's no loan involved in borrowing a car. Borrowing a car is borrowing is lending an object, and you were going to return the car as is. There's no loan involved. However, that is only about the car. It doesn't help for the gas, because gas is a real loan. You're not returning the same gas, you're returning different gas. So if you use the gas, so first of all, even to return the same amount of gas is a shaila of halva sabisa, which we'll discuss when we get to sabisa. But certainly to return, if you borrow the car with a half a tank, to return it with a full tank, definitely seems like ribbis. So this is a very extensive discussion in today's price game. And the truth is that even though it does seem like ribbis, there are many reasons to be many arguments for leniency, and primarily that you didn't really borrow gas, you borrowed a car. The car comes with gas. So not everyone's so comfortable with that because what does the car run on? If you're borrowing a car, the car doesn't run on air. The car doesn't run on water, runs on gas. So you obviously, by definition, you're borrowing gas. So we're not going to rely on that by itself. However, as we just discussed, when you borrow a book, you can return the book with flowers. You can return the book with chocolate. So when you borrow a car, you can return the car with gas. So the best thing to do is what the place can say is to say clearly that you lent me the car, I'm returning the car to you, and as a sign of appreciation for lending me the car, I filled up the gas at the time. Because again, this is something that's not ribbis. You're not paying back for lending you gas. You're not giving extra for lending gas. You're giving extra gas as a token of appreciation for lending the car. That's exactly the same case as giving a bar of chocolate as a token of appreciation for lending you a book. Um, if you're not sure how much gas there was in the first place, then that's it's a different hatter than when we spoke earlier. That you're not if you're filling up more because you're not sure, so that's not agar noter. Okay. Um, but again, that's usually not even that's not the shaila. It's usually a separate shaila, and as we mentioned, even returning the same amount of gas is a separate discussion of sabasa, which we'll get there, Be'ezus Hashem, when we get there. Um, Ribbis applies is the last thing we'll speak about before we stop for today. Even something that's less than a shavet pruta, which the lamdas of this we're not going to get into because first of all, what's the chiddush? Even less than a shavet pruta is so chatzi shir also even to steal also less than a shavet pruta is also so what's okay. It's a discussion which we're not going to get into, but the halacha is that Reuven lends money to Shimon on condition I'm lending you $100 on condition you're gonna pay me back $100.01 is ribbis ktsutsa midaraisa. It's ribbis ktsutsa, even if less than a shava pruta. So this leads us to a question of paying back extra a few pennies or even a few dollars if you don't have change. But that is not a question of ribbis ktsutsa deraisa because it wasn't stipulated. It's a question of ribbis b'shas peruin, which is ribbis derabana, which we'll discuss uh, when we talk about ribbis b'shas peruin. However, something that is very common, that's ribbis is something that's less than a shava pruta, has to do with kids. Children uh, play games and they trade things with each other, trading cards, toys, candies, snacks, and all these things. These are very often shilas of ribis deraisa. I'm gonna give you a lollipop on condition that you're gonna give me back two lollipops tomorrow, or two cookies, or it doesn't have to be mimin halva. If it's worth more, two cookies are, let's say it's worth more than a lollipop. So this is ribis deraisa if it's stipulated at the time of the loan. And if it's not stipulated, still ribbis derabbanan. And obviously, just like you have to be um, mechanech kids and all the other mitzvahs in the Torah, so there's an important to be mechanech kids with the isser of ribbis. And besides the fact that the chinuch of the isser of ribbis, it's also chinuch in the mitzvah of Avos Yisrael, as we discussed in the previously that the according to the Ramban, the side of ribbis is Avos Yisrael, and when kids are educated that we don't lend we don't give things to our friends because we're going to get something out of it in return, but simply because of Avos Yisrael. So this is obviously important chinuch in the area of Avos Yisrael. So there's no such thing as I'm gonna give you five Rebbe cards on condition that you're gonna give me back six. I'm gonna borrow a lollipop from you on the condition that I'm gonna give you back two lollipops tomorrow or two rugulach or whatever it is. This is all ribbis, potentially ribbis derais, at the very least, ribbis derabbanan. Another common case, which again, everyone who speaks about ribbis and any shir, you're gonna listen to ribbis, somebody's gonna say this, and all this farm ribbis say this, but it's a common thing. It's important to say. Father who two kids, one gets a candy, one doesn't get a candy. The kid that doesn't get a candy is obviously very upset. So the father says to the bigger kid, "Give your brother a candy, and when we get home, I'm gonna give you two candies." This is Ribis deraisa. Ribis deraisa, because who's the borrower over here? Not the younger sibling. The father is the borrower. Father's borrow. So lend me a candy. I'm going to give it to your younger brother. And then when we get home, I'm going to give you back two candies. It's rivers there. And there's a very simple solution. And the very simple solution is you don't say, give your brother the candy and I'm going to pay you back two candies. You say, lend your brother the candy and I'm going to pay you back two candies. And the reason that that is okay is because ribis that does not come from the leva to the malva is permitted under certain conditions. The Alter Rebbe says later in Sif Samach as long as the malva, sorry, as long as the third party, as long as the third party is paying from their own money, not from the leva's money, and the leva does not say explicitly, "Ish pleni yitin l'cha b'shvili," I'm borrowing money from you, and my friend is going to pay you ribbis on my behalf. That's usher at the very least because of haram service. But in this case, the leva, you're saying lend the candy to your brother. The leva is the younger sibling. The third party is the father. The third party is allowed to pay ribbis to the malva, who is the older sibling, because the ribbis does not come from the leva to the malva, and it was not stipulated by the leva, and it does not come from the leva's personal money. So therefore, that is perfectly okay. So again, here we have a very good example of something that we spoke about. That's something that ribbis is very common, but it's also a lot of times the solution to ribbis is very simple. It's just about knowing the halachas and knowing how to frame and present a certain situation, a certain transaction to turn it from something that's ribbis deraisa mamish into something that's heter gomer mamish. And with that, we'll stop for today.